everyone. It's Coffee and Politics Online with Cindy Walker, and we're going to have a robust discussion today. I am joined by Dr. Michael Phillips, who was on before, discussing his first book, White Metropolis, and I always cut the title off. I'm so sorry that I do it, because I tell everybody, get the book. You want to understand things here in Dallas. And I'm joined here with his wife, Betsy Friauf, and they co-authored The Purifying Knife. And I don't know if you guys remember, he mentioned this to me when I first had him on to talk about eugenics. And there was a lot of, a lot of surprising details in the book that I was really shocked by. One, just the level of audacity that people had, but it really explains kind of why we are where we are today with this. So, good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you for coming back on.
We're excited. We're excited to be here.
Yes. So, tell us, what was the motivation with writing this book?
Well, I have to say that I feel like it's really relevant, and particularly with some of the things you see going on in the current administration, Robert Kennedy Jr., I think that we are seeing a revival of eugenics ideas. Elon Musk, is basically embracing the modern version of eugenics. I think we should explain what eugenics is, because not everyone knows.
Yes.
So, eugenics was the attempt by misguided, wealthy people and scientists to scientifically breed racially superior humans. And Americans are really uncomfortable acknowledging that or confronting this.
Okay.
But it was actually the Americans and British who had a giant influence on Nazi Germany. And so in terms of our, like for instance, our segregation laws influenced the laws that made it a crime, for instance, for Jewish and non-Jewish people to marry and have relationships, that they were inspired by our segregation. The eugenics movement in Germany actually had its biggest source of inspiration from the British and the Americans. And so the eugenicists tried to reshape the human species two ways. Number one, by identifying people they thought were quote-unquote unfit, people who they felt were not biologically
viable candidates to carry on the human race.
By forced sterilization, that meant castration for men. Later on, vasectomies by court order, by government order. Women were forced to undergo hysterectomies or tubal ligations as the technology changed. And about 64,000 people that we know about across the United States were subjected to these forced operations. And this went on, by the way, a lot of people who are familiar with eugenics think that after the horrors of the concentration camps of Germany, because the Nazis really plunged in like no other group, they think that after the Holocaust this ended. But in the United States, there were people who were being manipulated and pressured into having operations well into the 1990s.
And so, yes, because there was a lot being whispered, or people felt like some women, except for Provera, were being forced to take the birth control injection, and it really messed them up. So later on, they ended up not being able to have children.
More planned, like some people talked about as a requirement, they were targeting women of color because racism was, but also poor whites, I'll say. But if women were needing government assistance there were proposals in front of state legislature as well as a requirement to get welfare, SNAP, whatever. We ought to require them to have the Norplant cards.
So we're not continuing to have to pay for their children.
Because the children were supposedly unfit. Yeah. So this is an ongoing thing.
Yes. I'm
So
sorry.
we were talking about
laughable.
how we decided that this was a book that
Yes.
needed to be written.
Yes.
And we started on this, I would say about 12 years ago.
Yeah.
So it took just about that long. We published it in June. We both had day jobs along the way, of course, but as we went along and as we were writing and absorbing the research we were doing, the political landscape in this country changed quite a bit, and science denial became rampant, especially during COVID, and we began to feel two things that were sort of opposite feelings, if you will. We felt that this work was more important and more relevant than ever to talk about this part of the history of where medicine and ethics and public policy intersect. But we also had some misgivings about how it would be perceived, how it might be used to make it better known that the, pardon the pun, cutting edge scientists of 100 years ago turned out to be wrong about whether human beings could actually influence their own evolution through, you might say, weeding out people who were considered unfit.
Like, for instance, we were really worried about all the anti-vaccine politics and climate change denial, which is killing people today.
Right.
So, one of the things that we found to deal with that, because we are telling a tale of science going very wrong. But one of the points we want to make when we talk about this book is eugenics, which was, like almost every country in the planet had a eugenics program.
Right.
So the idea of who was the fit, who was very country by country. But Japan, the Japanese saw themselves the most fit. So China. But in the United States, it was white supremacists. And one of the points we want to make is that in the United States and in Great Britain, it thrived in an atmosphere where there was no diversity. And that people who were marginal were able to see the flaws and the logic behind eugenics, but they weren't there. They didn't have the position to challenge the science.
Okay.
And so science actually works in an atmosphere where we have a diversity of voices, background, and all this effort to strip away diversity, equity, inclusion actually creates an atmosphere where tragic, terrible ideas like this can reach prominence, and that's I think that's one of the targets. We want to make sure people are aware of this. That eugenics is a metaphor for what happens when you have a monolith, the same culture, the same background,
ended up being the same gene pools.
Yeah.
As I was reading it, I mean, literally, I thought about Gattaca, and I've mentioned Gattaca before on the show with Edwin Flores, and I feel like if they could have played around with genes and spliced genes in order to make so-called superior individuals, that they would have done that.
Right.
Gladly and thankfully, they did not have that kind of capability back then. But you brought up a really great point that this was a global thing. All countries had a eugenics program, and the thing that boggled my mind so much, and I've laughed during the show, and it's not because it's funny, it's just laughable because people talk this way. And as much as I think of myself in a highly fashion, the concept of putting others down or eliminating their life because I think they're peasants, and there are people that I think are peasants that I don't feel like. I feel like they're like fleas, mosquitoes, and cockroaches. Okay, and those are just my personal opinions, just because I have beef with them. But I would never think about extinguishing someone's life or a whole family or tribe or race of people because I feel like they're inferior. So, did you guys come across information? Because that's the thing that disturbs me, the most, is the audacity to think that you are superior. And these are white men here, and I do want to go into kind of how the beginning kind of sets us up for where we are, especially here in Texas today. But any information that gave rise to why they felt they were superior.
Well, I will say that women were very much involved in this movement, like Betsy and I read about. There's a juvenile detention facility that's still open in Gainesville, Texas. It was called originally the Gainesville School for Girls, and the first director of that, it's operating now. It's young men are now detained. 100 years ago, the first director was a eugenicist, and it was a woman.
It was a woman. Her name was Carrie Weaver Smith, and she had some progressive ideas for her time.
Okay.
She opened the school up more. It had been pretty much like a prison, and she made sure that the girls got to go on field trips, and she wanted them to be able to get out in nature around the school. It's a rural area. She helped them establish a Girl Scout troop, for instance. She believed that these kinds of influences could help these girls perhaps re-enter society and be, productive.
Okay. Yeah.
A lot of these girls back then wound up in these places, these juvenile detention facilities, because they'd become pregnant outside of marriage, which back then, of course, was taboo.
Yes.
And it was also, unfortunately, back then, considered a sign of a moral defect, in the girls.
Which
even
they
though a
connected
lot
to
of
mental
them,
defect.
even though, of course, a lot of them had been raped. But anyway,
yes.
she also brought in a eugenicist to advise. So it just shows how some people who are trying to do the right thing, sometimes they get led astray.
Wow.
Well, it's they never could work out the whole nature versus nurture thing, and they were very contradictory. There were a lot of logical problems within the movement. But Carrie Weaver Smith, she is remarkable because she was dealing at a time with juvenile justice where in other facilities in Texas, she toured one in Dallas where the girls were literally chained by their wrists and left to hunt to the ceiling where their feet were touching. So so there was real serious physical abuse by the institutions. So she was horrified by that. But then, while she'll say a lot of these girls are victims of neglect and abuse, she said also biologically they've got a problem. And so, like for instance, she specifically spoke about Native American women having these inclinations toward supposedly being sexually promiscuous and being deceitful. And so you ask, why did they think? Why did they think they were superior? Well, history is about ebb and flow, right? Like at different points in the history of the world, Africa has a technological edge. Egypt was the center, of the Western world. China, obviously, the technological advantages ebb and flow. And this is part of a 300-year period where Europe, stealing technology for other parts of the world, develops a technological edge, and then to justify the dominance they have, where they enslave Africans, they enslave and exterminate Native Americans, they conquer, they colonize.
Right.
It seems to be a form of psychological compensation to then say, we're doing this because we're superior, right? And the idea of eugenics itself actually stemmed from agriculture, because they were aware that, you know, you can breed cattle to produce more beef.
Right.
You can breed dogs to herd sheep. You know,
Yes.
But they're talking about, like they're trying to do that with human biological.
Which our DNA is so much more complex.
Exactly.
Well, I mean,
exactly.
they didn't know what they were doing. That was the remarkable thing, because they didn't even have the terminology yet. The term genetics is going to be coined in a couple of decades into the 20th century, and they're starting to talk about eugenics in the 1880s.
Yes.
They didn't know about recessive genes. They thought that there was like one. Like they would talk about the germ seed. They would use these strange terms, and they thought that like one, like
plants, yes.
Yeah,
That's right.
they plasm, germ plasm. They would use it because they didn't know the mechanics of how traits pass from one generation to the other, and they thought that each, like if we use the term gene, one gene causes one trait, when in fact sometimes it's thousands of genes.
Yes.
Thousands of genes. And you
Yes.
have recessive genes that don't, sometimes become the trait that the person inherits, sometimes the dominant gene. It's like it's the difference between trigonometry and simple addition. And they were trying to use simple addition.
Yes.
Yeah.
For very complex situations.
And they thought that characteristics such as becoming a criminal were inherited directly through genetics.
Everything. Patriotism, work ethic.
Love that.
Musical talent.
Everything is purely a matter of biology, and
To
of
them
course,
at that time.
that's what they thought.
That's what they, and I'm reading it saying, okay, well, poverty drives a lot of criminal activity because you're poor, you're hungry, your Maslow hierarchy of needs, your basic level is not getting met, and you're trying to survive. It's not that you wake up and say, oh, I want to go rob a bank or I want to go do this stuff. It's literally out of survival mode.
Right.
So that obviously also affects your health.
Yes.
Which, and affects, all sorts of issues. They were acting on a very small base of knowledge, and they went way ahead of the data they had and drew sweeping conclusions. And they were in positions of power, so there was someone to check them. And the media at the time, newspapers, politicians, they were less sophisticated about the science, and the scientists were, obviously. And so they accepted what they were being told by the scientific community. And one of the interesting stories, I think, if you talk about the national story, we don't go into it as much. We don't go to
Dr.
it
Phillips,
as much.
I'm having a moment here. I'm floored. I'm literally floored by the ignorance or unlearned attitudes and capabilities that
The
they're
arrogance. The arrogance.
Yes, that they're displaying.
It was surprising to us also, as the more we read the letters that were written by these folks and the campaigns that they mounted to
Right.
They would take their supposed scientific findings and go.
They went on road trips with
give
it.
speeches
Yes, they were writing letters to legislators and elected officials.
Yeah.
So the thing that happens is eventually, like on the national scale, there's a member of a group that is targeted around the world by eugenicists. A Jewish anthropologist in the United States named Franz Boas, who's going to actually come up with some of the most smartest critiques of eugenics, but he's excluded. And the mainstream eugenics movement is saying, well, you could ignore him because he's Jewish. You know, he's
part of
advocating
the
for his
inferior group.
Right. Yeah, and he's advocating for his group, and they don't recognize their own biases. But one of the interesting things, I think the big surprise in our book, maybe the biggest surprise, is so you had from 1907, when Indiana passed the first forced sterilization law, to 1937, when Georgia passed the last one. So you have a 30-year period exactly where states were passing laws where they could sterilize people with mental illness, people with mental disability, the physically disabled prisoners, gay men in particular, you know, were often targets. These laws allowed that. There were 12 states that didn't pass.
Okay. Did not.
That did not pass these, and Texas was one of them.
Yeah.
And
very
so,
shocked by this.
and when I asked groups, you know, which states do you think were the states that passed the laws? And almost always the audiences, Betsy can confirm this. Yeah, she can confirm the surprise we always get. I say, okay, what part of the country was eugenics the most influential and the most powerful? People always say, oh, it had to be the South. And actually, no.
California.
It was California. California performed a third of the national, or maybe more, of the sterilizations, and up until the 1990s. The South actually was one of the regions where the least sterilizations took place, legal sterilizations. Now there were exceptions.
Really?
Georgia, Virginia, there were states where, you know, they were pretty prolific. Oklahoma, by the way, big sterilization state, but not Texas. And so we're exploring this mystery. How did Texas step outside of this?
Right.
Now there were some that were not legally authorized, but Texas was not part of this big movement.
So if you're just joining in, Dr. Michael Phillips and his wife, Betsy Friauf, authored The Purifying Knife. We're talking about the history of eugenics here in Texas, and just the revelations that you guys discovered as part of writing this book, and to talk about the states that were very adamant passing the legislation for sterilization, and Texas not being that way. I thought it was very interesting because Texas was one of the last states to free slaves, and there was conflict with the business class wanting the undesirable Mexicans for basically next to nothing labor. And again, but the beginning of this book, oh my God, had me in a grip. I had to get on my Peloton to ride, to clear my head, because I was so furious. Because one, you deemed yourself superior to everyone else, and you're deciding the fate of everyone else. And part of the motivation with eugenics, and I'll say part of the motivation, was making sure there was not an uprising. So for slaves to want their freedom and to participate in living their lives like they wanted to was against what the elites wanted. And I would say that was probably, along with wiping out the Native Americans, that those were two tails that they were like, we have to put a clamp down on this, because if not, we will lose our position in society. I mean, that's what I saw.
Well, you had two competing impulses in Texas.
Yes.
And you had greed competing with racism. Now, that often overlaps, and it does in this particular case. But the eugenicists were convinced that that Western people descended from Western Northern Europe
Yes.
were the racial cream of the crop, and that everyone else was degenerate and savage. And for the United States to be a
Melting
power, they needed to keep everyone else out, right? I mean, that was the eugenicist position. They were very anti-immigrant, and I mean, the relevance in this era, Trump's saying they're not sending their best. That's what the eugenicists were saying, right? And so one of the things that the eugenicists really wanted, there was a congressman from Texas named John Box from East Texas, Crockett, Texas, who really played a role in keeping people from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe out of the country. And by the way, those laws kept Anne Frank's family from coming to the United States during World War II, during the Holocaust. They wanted to extend quotas that they set up for those countries for Latin America, including Mexico. Because they thought the country's being flooded with these quote-unquote inferior Mexican immigrants. The problem is those landowners
wanted them here to exploit them.
They were exploiting three groups. They're exploiting poor white people. Mm-hmm. They're exploiting, of course, African Americans, as they had since the time of slavery.
Yes.
And they're exploiting Mexican immigrants.
For labor in agriculture, in
Yes.
fields, and
Yes.
also in factories.
Yeah. So they wanted wide open immigration because they wanted to pay the lowest wage possible. And if you're an immigrant, you could get deported if you try to form a union. There are all kinds of ways you can exploit. An immigrant coming to a new country may not know their legal rights.
Language barrier.
So there are all kinds of ways to exploit immigrant labor, and so they didn't like the eugenics program at all. And so what they would make racist arguments against the racist eugenicists. They were saying the eugenicists are wrong, because the eugenicists are saying they're going to come in, they're going to reproduce in large numbers, they'll overwhelm us, and they'll
rape our women.
And they're saying the women will seduce our men, and they'll have inferior children and so on. But the landowners would make a different racist argument. They would say, have you ever seen a superior civilization like the Anglo-Saxon civilization overthrown by a group like the Mexicans? And so it was one racist argument against another racist argument. And in this case, greed won out over white supremacist ideology.
Yes.
And so they were never able to close the border. And that's what's so fascinating about the effort to close the border now, because things have changed.
Yes, and the farmers are feeling it because Trump was supposed to go after the criminals. They weren't supposed to come after, quote unquote, the good migrant workers that were coming, but everyone is being rounded up. And if 2025 has not demonstrated the FAFO concept,
but there were other reasons, right, Betsy, that the eugenics movement didn't succeed in succeeding.
Yes, please. I'm having a mental meltdown right now. I commend y'all for writing this.
Well, thank you so much.
I don't know if I could have.
We know it's a downer. We know it is. We hope, though, that what people can get from it is that once you know the history of these toxic ideas, you're better positioned to push back against them. And I'm almost 70 years old, and I had, for a while, I'm an old white lady, but for a while I had thought that we were starting to get past these exclusionary, these toxic, racist ideas. And
my generation, we thought that.
And anyway, I hope that seeing a bit of the history of some of these ideas
wakes people up.
I hope it does. I hope it's helpful.
Yeah.
I would say as a historian, we're gloomier as a group, we're not. And I would say that these ideas were always there. Eugenics never went away.
Right.
And we really see it flowering back with people like, for instance, when you have J.D. Vance saying, you know, he wants, these families, and he means white families, to have more children.
Yes.
Yeah, that he doesn't want to make it easier to have children by increasing wages or, providing health care universally.
And making sure kids are educated and all that kind of stuff. Yes.
So, but he wants larger, you have Elon Musk, who's now a transplanted Texan, who talks about both transhumanism. We talk about in our last chapter the idea that you selectively breed people for their traits, but you also add technology to their bodies to create a super kind of almost cyborg type of, like in science fiction.
Now we're going into Star Trek.
and then Peter Thiel, who of course funded J.D. Vance's career. So we have these very powerful, and they seem to be centered in high tech in California, although that industry is moving with Musk to Texas.
Yes.
And they're bringing their ideas with them.
Vote against proposition for the water infrastructure, because that will not bring water to commoners. It will bring water to data centers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're going to have a crisis that's going to affect agriculture and people's homes and everything. But anyway, so these ideas are very prevalent today. And it's barely, and that's the thing, because, so the Holocaust happened. For a time, it became embarrassing to call yourself a eugenicist because the Nazis were eugenicists. But what happened is, it kind of worked, and we have to talk about this, that the progressive movement of the early 20th century, they were not the only advocates of eugenics. You had the entire political spectrum. Very right-wing people, very left-wing people, very people in the middle. Yeah, it was accepted wisdom that it was educated people. But the progressives were the ones who got the bills passed, generally speaking. And the idea was, well, if we can purify food, make factories safer, improve traffic, better city planning. We can improve the human species. We just have experts run everything. After World War II and after the Holocaust, it was actually very often people who positioned themselves as environmentalists who said, well, we have an overpopulation problem, and that overpopulation is leading to pollution. We're running out of all these resources. We have to shrink the human species because we're going to outstrip our resources. And so they had groups like Zero Population Growth. And the thing is, those groups, ostensibly environmentalists, supposedly progressive, they always focused on Africa and Asia and Latin America and saying these people need to have fewer kids. They never looked at the fact that the United States was 60% of the world's population, consuming half or more of the resources. It's a matter of consumption rather than it is about too many people.
Right.
Perhaps at a certain point you reach a tipping point that maybe we're outstripping our resources.
But that all of the consumerism that we have with, everything is disposable. Our electronics and the e-waste that we have, definitely. That is a great point with looking at how greedy we are as a species.
Right.
That's causing the problem.
And of course the thing about that era, what I would call neo-eugenics, new eugenics, where they weren't, I don't think they were even conscious of the fact that they were being white supremacists, but they were, their conclusions were white supremacists because of what their focus was.
Right.
That they seemed to be unaware that the issue was economics, it wasn't biology. And that it was a human failing, and that the same old ideas that certain people of color, somehow are less disciplined than white people and will not use their resources as I see.
Right, and so there was a point with the progressives wanted to make sure that, you know, there was health care and education for those that were less desirable, but it still wasn't going to be top tier education.
I think probably too much of that education and some improvement in their quality of life is aimed at making them better, more compliant workers in many cases.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Which, do we want to talk about the war on higher education?
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
another factor too that we discovered that made Texas different than California. That's the main comparison we make, because California eugenics is a huge
Because
thing.
California is seen as being a very liberal state.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, California eugenics is hugely influential. And the first president of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, was one of the premier eugenicists in the country.
And have we said that this eugenical idea that we could improve the human species by deliberate breeding, if you will, that it was a misapplication, wouldn't you say, of the theory of evolution? That we can influence evolution by having fewer of the so-called undesirable people?
Well,
Yeah.
Charles Darwin never came in solidly for eugenics, although he made some comments that were sort of indicating an interest in that. It was actually his cousin, Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics. It's from two Greek words that mean good in birth. But so
what I think I'm getting at, though, is that these leaders of education who were so influential and had such big megaphones at the time, it was their misapplication of this theory of evolution.
Now, in California, of course, they were respected. The universities were funded. California saw a value in investing in colleges and universities. Texas, surprise, surprise, that was never the case. And that really undermined the eugenics movement in Texas. So you had a bad thing, because I think investing in higher education is a benefit.
Right.
But in this case, a bad thing prevented another bad thing from happening.
Because they were trying to use that as a jumping off point to solidify eugenics and why it needed to occur.
Well, in other states where they invested heavily in the universities were where the eugenicists mainly were headquartered. That's where it was the eugenicists tended to be professors. They tended to be people, or members of wealthy foundations, like one of Teddy Roosevelt's favorite, best friends, Madison Grant, was, a wealthy man, but he was part of that culture of higher education. In Texas, there was always a suspicion that people who went to college were elitists, they were snobs, money was being taken away from public schools to fund higher education for people who are going to be lawyers and doctors, and they're going to make a lot of money. Why are we subsidizing the education of the children of the wealthy who are just going to be rich and overcharge
and
us?
we pass vouchers.
but anyway,
go ahead. Yes, please. I'm sorry.
So you had this kind of phony populism that we're standing up for the common guy. We're going to put the money in public schools, which they didn't, rather than waste the money on these rich kids who can pay for private school. And so that really made it hard to recruit eugenicists here. And then you had people like there was a governor who got impeached, the only governor who's ever been impeached in Texas, James Pa Ferguson, and his wife later became Governor Ma Ferguson. And they both attacked the University of Texas. Jim Ferguson vetoed the entire budget for UT 1 year before he got impeached, and they fired one of the prominent eugenicists in the state. Ferguson did, not because of eugenics, but because he simply had endorsed Ferguson's opponent. And so this is sort of like side damage, collateral damage the
So
eugenics
that's why a lot
Some
of
of this
their
is sounding familiar.
Yeah.
real familiar. So that explains why a lot of their proposed bills never went anywhere
Right.
with the legislation.
They could not take it. And the fact is, and I want to say this, a lot of the people, obviously the people who criticize eugenics sometimes made very smart arguments. It wasn't just hostility to higher education. Like, one legislator in 1913, when they're debating a sterilization bill in Texas, and there were 10 bills that were proposed
Yes.
that the eugenicists backed, 9 of them failed. The only one that passed was one in 1915, where they expanded the number of state hospitals for those with mental disability and mental illness. Those were meant to warehouse people who were thought to be mentally deficient, and they put them in sex-segregated facilities so they couldn't reproduce.
Right.
Now, in 1913, they're debating a sterilization bill, and this one legislator says, look, here's the thing. What we think is cutting edge science now, 5 years from now, is obsolete. And we're going to sterilize people with the knowledge we have now. In 5 years, whenever, we might discover our diagnosis is wrong, that, that there's a cure for whatever the problem is. And then he attacks the arrogance of the whole eugenics concept. And so you had some very smart critiques, and of course the eugenics community would mock them. Look at these country bumpkins. They don't know what they're talking about. They're how unsophisticated they are. They should listen to us. And so that's what happens when you have
Think of double-edged sword.
when the elitists are insular and they come from the same background, and they're not hearing the diversity of voices. It's a very bad idea. It's very bad things happen.
Right. Oh gosh. So the parallels that we're seeing today with the history that you have covered in this book explains so much. And seeing that Texas is, part of what you wrote about was making sure that these undesirable segments of the human race should not be in power. And here we have a legislative body that is very rooted in a lot of these concepts in power, and not wanting to let go of that power. And I say that Texas was the test bank on it for what we're seeing today with redistricting and having one party rule here in this country.
Right.
Well, here's what's so terrible about the new censorship laws, because that's what they are, where they're talking about we can't talk about critical race theory, quote unquote, and they stretch that to mean any discussion of racism, slavery, whatever.
Yes.
Whatever. The history we're talking about, people are going to be reluctant to broach the subject. And so if these ideas come back, people are going to be less aware of the tragedies that occurred because of eugenics in the past. This is opening the door. Not only by stripping away diversity, equity, inclusion, are we creating the intellectual atmosphere that allowed eugenics to happen, but also by erasing the parts of the history that make some people uncomfortable.
Right.
Somehow knowledge should only be shared if everyone
Formally agrees to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
The fact is, good history offends somebody sometime. It can't help it.
Tell me something that doesn't offend somebody somewhere on this daggone planet. With all the people that we have, somebody's going to be offended by something. And I'm going to tell you, as someone who is, I am the poster child for offending people just from walking into a room. There is a point where you just say, hey, confront it, atone to it, and move past it.
It's fascinating to me, the very people who accused progressives, people who are fighting racism, and etc., being snowflakes and being easily offended.
Yes, and
the T-shirts that say "F your feelings" and all that are the biggest snowflakes in the world. And there's this idea that somehow if a child learns about how other children were subjected to genocide or enslavement or all sorts of exploitation, and somehow the modern privileged child is going to be damaged psychologically by confronting the truth. I mean that is
and it also minimizes the trauma
right
of those that have suffered under that.
People with power and privilege are the ones who victimize other people.
Yes.
Yeah, and so there's no way to tell history honestly without confronting the fact that American history was shaped by racism, by white supremacy, and that white supremacy had many victims. And by the way, one of the ironies is, like when we talk about eugenics, the numerically, the biggest number of victims were poor white people. Poor white people were castrated. Poor white people were subjected to essentially medical experiments. And that history is being erased, the suffering that white racism caused to people today who would be defined as white, but they're considered inferior white, lesser whites. And so it really is a disservice. And in fact, many of the students who they're worried about offending, their ancestors may have been subject to this,
Right. And that's one thing that I definitely want you guys to point out. It wasn't just people of color. So Mexicans, Asians, Polynesians, blacks, Native Americans, we were all in the same boat, seen as being completely undesirable. But Italians,
Italian immigrants. Some of the, at the time, the recent immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, and
were seen as
Jewish people from a lot of different
in some
countries.
places, including in Texas, Italians were lynched. In New Orleans, there was a mass lynching in the 1890s of Sicilian immigrants who were blamed for the assassination of a police commissioner. This is, and this.
Even the Irish, were subjugated to poor treatment. So
they were seen as non-whites, which people have trouble wrapping their minds around. But the definition of who's white has changed over time because that has no biological meaning. There's no biological category of white person, or frankly black, or in any of the categories. But I will say this, and this is one of the frightening things that I think we should be disturbed by.
Okay.
The legal status of eugenics, these states have repealed these laws. However, the last word from the U.S. Supreme Court on eugenics was a 1927 case called Buck versus Bell, and this illustrates what we were just talking about a second ago. Carrie Buck was a woman from a poor family who was subjected to
she's a white woman.
A white woman who was subjected to sexual abuse by relatives. A relative raped her, and she got pregnant. And her mother had already been institutionalized because she got pregnant. Women's sexual behavior was always punished legally, very often socially. But anyway, so she's pregnant and she's institutionalized, and the authorities put her in a hospital and they say she's mentally deficient. And so after she gives birth, a court in Virginia orders her to undergo sterilization. Attorneys represent her and make her case. It goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court in the majority decision says 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And they order the sterilization to proceed. They say, go ahead. She's forcibly sterilized. Later on, people who examined her, talked to her, interviewed her. She was of normal intelligence. She was a victim of neglect, poor education, and sexual abuse.
That we did not go after the man who did that.
No. The Buck versus Bell is the name of that case, the Supreme Court case, 1927, and it's right there with Plessy versus Ferguson. It's one of the worst decisions ever. Buck versus Bell has never been overturned. So the very last word of the Supreme Court on the power of the state to forcibly sterilize people is yes, states can do it. And so even though these states have repealed it, the Supreme Court has said such laws are constitutional. It's not a violation of due process.
And this is why elections have consequences, and if you do not know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And this is a clear illustration of history coming back, and it's going to bite us in the butt. I mean, I'm concerned as a single female and not having any male relatives being able to keep my bank account. And spend my money the way that I see fit, and losing my rights. And I definitely will be a woman that they would institutionalize. I'm surprised somebody hasn't tried to. Wink, wink. Somebody did. Yeah,
we chuckle, but it's
this is life changing.
It's within my mother's memory, and she was subjected to it, even as a middle-class white woman, not being able to control her own money, even though she had a good job in downtown Dallas. Yeah. She had to get her younger brother to co-sign for a car with her in the 1950s. Within memory.
I just don't think that people really understand the gravity of these choices and the elections and the consequences of it. And granted, we have paid candidates with the things that happened in the early 2000s and the late 1990s with corporations and donations and whatnot. But
one of the things that's real consistent throughout the story to the present day is that men in power have always assumed that they have the power to in particular determine what women do with their bodies, whether they should be encouraged to have large families or denied the ability to have it, or to be stripped of their ability to decide whether or not to have children. So there's sort of an interesting continuity between the repeal of choice in this country and
still being able to institutionalize people and sterilize people. And she was raped.
Yeah, Carrie Buck was raped. Yeah.
She was raped.
Yeah.
And he went without penalty. The relative went without penalty. And I know in the black community, we have faced this, and we protect the perpetrator and keep the family secret, and then wonder why some of our women behave the way that they do, because they probably have CPTSD or PTSD because they've been sexually assaulted by someone who loved them or was supposed to love them and was supposed to protect them. And it just, the arrogance of the men and the women that support men that have this power to make these decisions on the rest of our lives is I get they're playing the game of, well, if I'm with him, then I'm protected as a result of it. And who are you if you're not in the same position? Please get this book. Get both of his books. They're very eye-opening. This book draws so many parallels to what we are seeing today. It explains why we are going down the path that we are going, and it's just, it's mind-boggling. It's troubling. Yes.
One real quick thing. Actually, White Metropolis, my work on that led me to this book in a lot of ways, because one of the fascinating things that I came across when I wrote White Metropolis, and you find it in that book, where they used to have these Better Baby and Fitter Family contests, yes, where people would submit their children and their entire family to contests, and there would be these medical personnel who would, measure skulls and the angles of the foreheads and whatever. And these supposedly indicated who was fit and who wasn't fit, who was superior, who wasn't. And you would get a blue ribbon if your baby was supposedly the fittest family. And
these contests were held, for instance, at the state fair.
State Fair, Texas. Yeah. And so this was a story in the morning news about one of those contests, and we still have echoes of that today. They're still shattering people's lives because one of the things the eugenicists brought to the world were IQ tests, and the IQ tests have now mutated into these standardized tests, which very often are used to track students into certain programs where they get diverted away and they're treated as evidence of someone's abilities, inherent abilities, rather than a diagnosis of what they need help with. And so our whole education system is so rooted in these standardized tests, and I think it's killing learning. And I think it's very badly serving people who come from lower income families, people who are English as a second language or whatever. And we're still, so these Better Baby contests sort of are the grandparents of a lot of the malfunctions of the education system now. And parents are going to be less and less able to do this because the eugenicists were anti-democracy too. And I see a real echo in this seizure of school districts by the state, where they strip these districts where the population is mostly black and brown, and they strip them of the ability to govern their own schools.
Yes.
And even as the gerrymandering strips them of the ability to shape policy so the money is spent more equitably. And the resources are distributed more equitably.
So there was also a point in the book, and I think it was the progressives, where funding for schools for the less desirables was stripped.
Right.
And it was forced to means to force the kids and the families to go into agricultural work.
You saw that. That was more in California, where eugenics had more of a influence on policy. Texas, Texas used other means. They would say this child, they would fail the child, they wouldn't provide the language training necessary, they would put them in whatever the equivalent was of special education. They didn't call it that, but basically, and they would flunk them out. In a lot of school districts in Texas, Spanish, as primary language students, the education was only available to them through 6th grade. And suddenly there was because there was a parallel to Jim Crow called Juan Crow. And a lot of school districts in Texas, Mexican American kids only had public education through 6th grade, and then they were supposed to work in the fields. And of course, and poor whites also were subjected to this because the school calendar was so brief. It amounted to like 3 months a year, and they wanted them in the fields, even young children.
Yeah.
So poor whites, Mexican kids, black kids were all being exploited as labor very on, and they felt like, well, these people have biological deficiencies that mean this is the only thing.
This is all they'll amount to.
Okay.
I mean, of course, I'm very taken back and made speechless with this, because once again, I would be an undesirable. Well, I have German genes. My father is German and Swiss, so I would be a complete waste of superior genes. And at one point, he was a boarder in Oklahoma, and actually went to school on a farm, and it was exactly that, because his mom was divorcing his father, and back during this time, my father was born in 1923, didn't have the means of being able to be a single mom and work and take care of her children and whatnot. It's just deplorable.
Well, I jokingly in the acknowledgments I talk about my son,
Yes.
who would be an absolute nightmare for eugenicists because he has ancestors who are Italian, who are from Spain, who are from Native American, Jewish, all this other, and they was and he's been a super high achiever his whole life. So
Forget the environment that someone is raising. It is just purely genetics here. Thank you for this work.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about our book, The Purifying Knife, The Troubling History of Eugenics in Texas. And it's just hot off the press in June.
Yes.
And you can get it wherever books are sold, and we would encourage you to bypass Amazon if you can, if I can say that.
Yes.
But you can buy it online, and you can buy it. You can ask your local. The best thing is go to your local bookstore and say order it. And that way, you're supporting a local business. Terabang Books, Deep Vellum. Yeah, there are a lot of good bookstores in Dallas that you can go to.
Yeah.
Even Barnes and Noble. Just don't give your money to Jeff Bezos.
Yes. So it's just humans. We are complex. We are very fascinating and complex creatures, and it's disheartening the devastation that we cause to each other instead of embracing each other. Because if we're about being our brother's keeper, and God makes no mistakes, none of us are mistakes. We shouldn't be treating each other as if there is inferiority and superiority. And as much as I joke around peasants and commoners and whatnot, the troubling thing is that those of us who are deemed the undesirables on this planet outnumber the elites. But we buy into the BS of fighting each other instead of coming together and overthrowing them. And that's what they're afraid of. So, again, thank you so much
Thank you
for your time in writing this book. Next week, we will be talking about commercial projects, big projects, multi-million-dollar projects, and how they are funded. So Carl Biggers will be on to discuss this. So again, Saturday, it's now raining. Hopefully it won't rain anymore today, but enjoy your time with your loved ones. Do what matters most to you. And let's start being good to each other, even those that we don't know, because a lot of our environments shape who we are. It's not just our genetics, okay? Thank you so much. See you next Saturday.